Welcome to another episode of Policy Talks. And I have with me a professor from Australia who has been in the news in Indian publications, particularly because of his article that has questioned the very basis of rankings by three multilateral institutions, mostly European, on the ranking that they give out to India. And his article has created you may say a storm or a storm in a teacup here, about how valid or how correct these rankings are, and should they be accepted at face value, or is there conscious or maybe unconscious bias which is leading them? So, welcome to Policy Talk, Salvatore. Good to have you on the show. I wanted to begin.
It's great to be here.
Thank you. I wanted to begin this discussion, this conversation with the basis of your article, which we'll also share the link in the episode. But your basis or the assumption is that these three institutions, which is basically Economist Intelligence Unit, VDEM, and the Freedom House, they are not giving the correct picture when they rank India's democracy. So, what do you think the bias here is?
First, I should be clear that I can't tell you what the correct picture is, because that would imply that I had done my own ranking of India's democracy. What I can tell you is the evidence adduced by these three organizations is very weak. In many cases, it applies to the wrong period, and often it is outright mendacious. That is, the evidence given in support of their own rankings doesn't correspond to the rankings that they have given India. So I can't say what quality India's democracy is. I'll leave that to Indians to decide. But I can tell you that the evaluations provided by these three organizations are not in line with their own evidence. It's not in line with the evidence they themselves have presented in order to justify the low and rapidly deteriorating rankings for India over the last 4 years.
So, do you think that this is a conscious effort by these organizations to bring down the ranking? Because all these three organizations have, over the last 4 years, as you point out the period, have, like for instance, EIO has put India into a bucket of 53 other countries, which also has France and some of the European countries as a flawed democracy. So even US is seen as a flawed democracy now. Do you think that EIU has done this consciously? And do you really think you can bring in conscious or unconscious bias in an index that is supposed to be reflective of variables that are data? They're not subjective issues in that sense.
I don't think any of these organizations as an organization has an anti-India bias. In fact, there's a lot of goodwill towards India in the West, and certainly among Western governments and certainly among Western investors and business people. The problem here is that the rankings they do reflect the general opinion of those analysts and intellectuals who cover the countries they're ranking. So when the Economist Intelligence Unit ranks India, it's not sending a team from its own central headquarters out to India to do fact-finding. They're instead sending a survey. And all three organizations work the same way. They send a survey to people who in the field who do have knowledge of India. Now, in India's case, that survey is largely going to Indian intellectuals, Indian university professors, or non-resident Indian, but people of Indian origin who are university professors and think tank analysts outside India. These are also going potentially to journalists outside India, and maybe some other book authors and intellectuals. We don't have access to the list of experts they rely on. The only thing we do know is that for each country, they're relying on people who have some acknowledged expertise on that country. Now, it doesn't take an outsider like me to tell Indians that Indian intellectuals, broadly speaking, I can't speak for every Indian intellectual, but if you were to take a survey of university professors in India and ask what party they voted for, I can assure you that Narendra Modi's BJP would not be top of the list. So I think what we're seeing
that's
here,
not true. I mean, like,
well, elite.
some
Let me correct that.
universities would, because of their ideology per se, a left-wing ideology, have professors who would.
Let me correct that.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. Among elite university professors in the humanities and social sciences, these surveys are not going to physicists, they're not going to engineers, they're not going to mathematicians. These are going to social scientists and journalists only at the very top tier institutions, probably not mostly in India, probably among non-resident Indians who work at places like Harvard and Stanford, or even for that matter, University of Sydney. Now, I've met a lot of the people in this general social class. I've seen their writings. I've seen their books with titles like India, Democracy in Danger, or titles like Narendra Modi, The New Fascism, these sorts of things, the dangers of Hindutva philosophy. And they certainly have a right to that opinion. In no way am I saying that their opinions are not sincerely held, or even in many cases, fact-based. However, this is not a unbiased group of people who are dispassionately looking at the data. To put it another way, when I come to this table, I come to it as a comparative social scientist who's not an expert on India, who's an expert on ranking systems. When I look at it this way, I see there are a lot of problems with the methodology that these three organizations use, because inevitably people bring their own political biases into their evaluations of a country. I mean, I can see this in my own country. I'm American, and in the US, more than 95% of university professors who donate to a political party donate to the Democratic Party. If you try to evaluate Donald Trump's presidency and you ask a bunch of academics, you're going to get a very negative evaluation, regardless of what the reality of the situation might be. Now, it's possible that the reality is as bad as this group of experts say, but in answering your question very specifically, it's not the rankings agencies, the rankings organizations that set the rankings. It's their panels of experts who set the rankings. The rankings authorities are only reporting what their experts have said.
So you're saying that these indices have two parts. One is the panel of experts that they survey, and these panels of experts are, you're saying, are obviously biased against market-friendly policies or market-friendly political systems. Hence, they would the whole country as negative. And you're saying that Indian intellectuals abroad have a larger role to play in this, or a role to play in this?
They have a very big role to play in this. Again, I don't know the names of the people on the rankings panels, but I think we can safely assume that they involve the quote unquote the usual suspects. That is, journalists at places like the New York Times, professors at places like Harvard and Stanford. These are the sort of authorities that are depended on by organizations like Freedom House, Varieties of Democracy Institute, and the Economist Intelligence Unit. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I want to emphasize, if you want to know about democracy in a country, you should go to the experts on that country. The problem is when there is little or no editorial oversight, and the editorial oversight is so much lacks a real devotion to detail that errors even are reported in support of these negative rankings. And I can give you lots of examples of these errors that have been given in support of the rankings.
So, I mean, like, as you know, that even US or France is classified under a flawed democracy, and possibly at the same time that India was included or defined as a flawed democracy. So these two countries did not oppose or question or say that this ranking happened because a particular class of intellectuals was saying that this is biased, or the system, or this system of ranking is fundamentally flawed.
Sure, there are two reasons for that. First is that the US and France are at the top of that category, not in the middle or bottom of that category. These are very broad categories that are given by these organizations. So the US and France have not been downgraded to anywhere near the extent that India has. But the second reason is that Americans,
we only moved two ranks below. I mean, we're a flawed democracy.
Oh, the rank is far below. Oh, yes, but the rank is far below France's rank. I don't have the numbers at my fingertips. We can look them up. But the second reason is that France and the US don't care. That is, Americans and French people really couldn't care less what organizations in Washington or Sweden say about their country. Now, the problem is not that Indians have a thin skin. Indians should care, because India requires the cooperation of the rest of the world in a way that France or the US doesn't have to worry about. I mean, France is a member of NATO. France is a member of the European Union. France is not going to face anyone not being willing to invest there. It's not going to face any problems of people being unwilling to sell high technology equipment to the country. It's not going to face sanctions. These are not a problem for France, no matter what ranking France gets. It's certainly not a problem for the United States. For India, this is a problem. That is, there is the potential, for example, that the US would someday suspend technology cooperation with India if the idea becomes ingrained in American legislators' heads that India is not a democratic country. I mean, look at US-China relations. There's an absolute ban these days on US technology going to China. Why? Because there's a recognition that China is a hostile totalitarian state. Well, I routinely see Narendra Modi called a fascist dictator on websites, on Twitter. And when there are these ranking agencies that, okay, don't go that far, but when they back up that story, when they class India alongside Russia, well, then yes, many American legislators might be hesitant about entering into agreements with India in a way that they would have no hesitancy about France. They know France. They know French people know America. No one takes these rankings seriously. Look, my own president said twice on national television that Republican-controlled states were little better than the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. Has anyone suspended investment cooperation with Texas or Florida? I mean, nobody, because we know not to take that seriously. That's just politics. That's just Joe Biden doing Joe Biden. But when someone says about India, we don't know India. I mean, who knows whether or not India really is a democratic country? When we want to know, we have to Google it. And when we Google it, we get VDEM, Economist Intelligence Unit. We hear from Freedom House that India is partially free and that Kashmir is not free at all.
That's interesting. So you're saying that I mean, if I were to kind of structure your answer, the three elements which are coming out. One is that there is a popular narrative in the common media, which is the New York Times and Washington Post, which is against India. And this popular narrative, when combined with the narrative among intellectuals inside India and outside India, is creating a false picture via these indices, which paints India as a partially free, flawed democracy, and other elements, which then, in the sense, forms an incestuous circle with what the popular narrative already is. And it strengthens that narrative further on. So this, I mean, we can argue this same cycle or this negative cycle happening for any regime, can argue for it or against it. But fundamentally, you're saying that this has geostrategic impact on the way India's international relationships are going to be structured. Now, that is a very interesting, and it almost borders on the conspiracy theory. That is there a conspiracy theory behind this popular narrative combined with this